Okay, we'll begin. Some people may keep coming in, but that's okay. Thank you everyone for coming today to an event on normalization of Gulf states with Israel and implications of that. My name is Sara, and I'm the president of Palestine Working Group at SIPA, and we have a few other members of our group here as well today. We are co-hosting this event with the undergraduate group Columbia Students for Justice in Palestine, who also just recently passed the divestment vote in Columbia College, which is a historic moment for Columbia. But with that, I will actually give it over to Tariq to kick off the panel for us.
Thanks for the intro, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Tariq. I've also been part of the Palestine Working Group since starting at SIPA this fall. Before I get started, I really just want to thank our panel and all our attendees for taking the time today to be here, even though I'm sure everyone's very tired of Zoom. So to introduce our speakers before we get started, first off, we have Sumaya Almajdhoub, who is actually joining us today all the way from Bahrain. Sumaya is a member of the Gulf Coalition Against Normalization, a platform that brings together civil society organizations that advocate for the Palestinian cause in the Gulf. Sumaya holds a master's in Middle East Studies from George Washington University, and she is currently working as a researcher focusing on social and economic development in the Middle East. Next, joining us from the West Bank is Dr. Ghanem, who is a senior lecturer at the School of Political Sciences at the University of Haifa, and a founder of the Palestine Forum, an independent source for Palestine news and analysis from a diverse range of Palestinian contributors. His most recent book, Palestinians in Israel, The Politics of Faith After Oslo, gives voice to the Palestinian citizens of Israel and sheds light on the future of their struggle for equal rights. And last, but definitely not least, we have Dr. Rashid Khalidi, who is one of the world's leading scholars on Palestinian identity and history. Dr. Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies in the Department of History here at Columbia University, and he is also the co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. His latest book, 100 Years War on Palestine, delves deep into the lived experiences of Palestinians through decades of settler colonialism, war, and occupation, and shows that the only path to peace is through equality and justice. So before opening up to discussion, I thought I'd situate us very, very briefly. As most of you are aware, the United Arab Emirates announced plans to formally normalize relations with Israel in August, and about a month later, Bahrain followed suit. And there are growing indications that other countries in the region will soon announce similar agreements. So although neither the UAE nor Bahrain were ever at war with Israel, the normalization announcements have definitely made headlines for a variety of reasons. Unfortunately, however, much of the discourse in the mainstream media here has focused on potential weapons sales and the Trump administration's so-called deal of the century, while ultimately ignoring the impact normalization will have on the Palestinians and the future of their struggle. So hopefully we can shed more light on that today. So that's definitely enough from me. I'd like to now turn it over to our panel and ask our first question, which is, what do these normalization agreements really mean, and how will they impact the lives of Palestinians? I'm hoping all three of you can talk to this, but Sumaya, could you possibly start us off?
Sure, thank you so much, Tariq, Sarah, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to participate in today's panel. I think for us, especially speaking from the Gulf region, I think that I can mention three quick points about the implications of these accords. Number one, these accords are a reward for bad behavior. Essentially what has happened, Israel continues to violate international law, continues to deprive Palestinians of their human rights. And what has essentially happened, we've almost rewarded them for this behavior by signing these peace accords with UAE and Bahrain. So this is really honestly incredibly worrisome and sets a very difficult precedence. Plus, if there was any leverage the Gulf states could have used in any negotiations, this leverage is lost. So this is the first point that I wanted to mention. The second point I wanted to mention is what's happening today with these accords is that it's not only a normalization. I mean, I think there's a lot of differences. Sorry, I think someone's mic is on. Okay.
Sorry, muted everyone, but Sumaya, if you could unmute yourself.
All right. Thank you. So the first point is this is reward for bad behavior. The second point, what's happening is honestly something that's beyond normalization. Like what the UAE and Bahrain are doing, some analysts have characterized this as an alliance rather than normalization. So you're not just opening up embassies, there's like active security, intelligence cooperation that's happening. For what purposes, I am not sure. For example, like the head of Israeli intelligence was just in Bahrain, visiting Bahrain last week. This is like an open visit. Now, I mean, I think for me, like these accords were not necessarily a surprise for us. We have seen other events that have led up to this signature. And these meetings have been happening covertly under the table, but it's really worrisome for this type of like open coordination happening. For what purpose, I am not sure. The third thing that I want to mention is that what's happening also, the implications of these accords, there's an active sort of effort to change the narrative around the Palestinian struggle for self-determination and liberation. So what we're seeing is that there's active campaigns, discourses that are being pushed to completely like change the narrative. And I think, and this is happening very much so in different news outlets in Arabic that's steered towards the Arab public. Now the Arab public is very much their position hasn't changed. Their support for Palestine has not changed. But there is a worry that this discourse might have an implication later on in the future and how people understand the Palestinian cause, how this might shift public opinion in the future. So, so these are the 3 points that I wanted to kind of open up with, and thank you.
Dr. Khalidi, do you want to say something?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for who's attending, for being there, wherever you may be in the real world. I want to pick up on something that Sumaya said, because I think that when we talk about normalization, we are talking about a process that encompasses only regimes and not public opinion in the Arab world. So the Arabs are not in favor of normalization with Israel. The regimes of certain Arab countries are in favor of normalization with Israel. And we are talking about a body of the most unrepresented regimes on earth, some of the few absolute monarchies that still exist, and some military dictatorships like that in Egypt or Algeria, which rule against and in spite of their people by crushing their people and repressing their people. And we have evidence of this from a survey that was just released by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. It was released in Washington, I think, yesterday. And they have done regular public opinion surveys of Arab countries. They just finished a survey of 28,000 people across 13 Arab countries, including Morocco, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and 8 others. And the figures are absolutely astounding. 88% of the people surveyed disapprove of their governments recognizing Israel. That's Arab public opinion, not what this general or this absolute monarch or this kleptocrat who depends for power on external support from the United States and now from Israel says. Those people represent only themselves, only the elites that govern these countries, which do not feature consent of the governed, which are not democratic, which are not in fact, countries where the people have any voice whatsoever. So I think this is really, really important. A majority, according to this survey, 88%, disapprove of their governments recognizing Israel. And you can go country by country. Sudan, for example, is being forced by the United States and the Emirates towards normalization. And in fact, one of the leading war criminals who is a leading figure in the new regime, a general, Hameti, his name is Degalo, his actual name is Degalo, it made a statement just today saying, you know, we have to have relations with Israel. Israel is a civilized country. We need Israel. He's one of the key figures in the military junta, which is part of the post-Bashir regime. In Sudan, according to the survey, only 13% of respondents were in favor of their country recognizing Israel. 79% are opposed. In Saudi Arabia, 6% of respondents agreed with recognition. 65% opposed. So that's our public opinion. I am not particularly worried about this normalization between these two countries, which are not and have never been at war with Israel, because they've always been close to Israel. Sumaya mentioned security cooperation. The anti-missile defenses of the Emirates for many, many years have been created and manned by a branch of Raytheon based in Israel, by an Israeli company. Israelis are responsible for the anti-missile defenses of the United Arab Emirates, and they have been for years and years and years. What that means is that, in effect, Israel's forward missile defenses are not just the Jabal al-Sheikh, Mount Hermon, and Palestine. They are the United Arab Emirates. Jabal Ali, actually, is the forward. So Israel has already expanded into the Gulf. Israel has intelligence operations in 4 or 5 Gulf countries, by which I mean they have a station of the Mossad with an official recognized by the government. This is not just Oman. This is not just Bahrain. This is not just the Emirates. This is also Qatar. So you have in 4 of these countries long established security relationships with Israel, long established subterranean diplomatic relationships. And these happen to be, in the cases of the countries I mentioned, absolute monarchies where consent of the government has absolutely nothing to do with the way in which government operates. So I think that's really important when we talk about normalization, the Arabs this or the Sunnis that. No, a few kleptocrats in the Gulf, terrified of their own people and of Iran, have made an alliance with Israel, which is a long-standing alliance. It was surreptitious, now it's public. It's a matter of concern, of course. I don't think so much because Arab public opinion is likely to change, but because there is a view, which is a shared bipartisan view in the United States, that normalization and peace between Israel and the Arab countries is a good thing, irrespective of how much Israel is stepping all over the Palestinians and denying their rights and maintaining its occupation. I think that's problematic. And that's not just the Trump administration or the Republican Party. That is a bipartisan view shared by Biden and the leadership of the Democratic Party. There's a lot of there's a strong dissident view in the Democratic Party against this, but this is a bipartisan view, and it's a view shared by many European governments. I think that is problematic, actually. I'll stop there.
Dr. Ghanem, if you have anything to add.
You have to unmute Asad.
Sarah, do you have to unmute him?
Okay, here. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Tariq, for inviting me to this event. And thanks for inviting me to speak with Rashid and Sumaya. I'm concerned about this normalization process because it is my concern is related to the question, how do I understand this normalization, new normalization between the Arab region, the Arab states, and Israel. And I think that it is basically related to a series of events that occurred in the last decade, and that signals to us as the Palestinians that we are in a very bad shape. We are in a very bad situation. I mean, of course, we all remember the Trump plan, which is also related to this issue, that the normalization process. I mean, it is part of the package how to market this this plan by Trump. But what concerns me most is what Sumaya what Sumaya named as the giving the present to the occupier, to the Israeli side. And Israel will, as I understand it, will benefit from this normalization process. It is, I agree with Professor Khalidi that this is not a normalization with the Arab peoples, with the Arab masses. But of course, when speaking about the Arab world, what matters is normalization with the regimes, with the state. And with this normalization, of course, is related to the general and the whole development, which is related to the fact that Arab state refused to condemn as a group in the Arab League the normalization between Israel and the Emirates and Bahrain. And secondly, the fact that I'm quite sure that Saudi is backing up this normalization. Sudan partially is part of the normalization. Yemen, at least partially, it is part of the normalization. Of course, Egypt and Jordan and part of the maybe Morocco and other Arab states, which means that Israel benefits from the fact that it was looking for a kind of legitimacy in the Arab region, and it is granted at least by the Arab regimes. And this is not only the question of legitimacy, it is the fact that there are in this region, there are three main alliances, there are three main coalitions. One is led by Turkey, the other is led by Iran, and the third is led by Israel. And no state in the Arab world is the main player in these coalitions, and they are just belong to one of these alliances. And these three main players, Israel, Iran, and Turkey, they are using the Arab region as their playing yard, as their place where they are trying to test their power in the region. The Arabs will lose from this kind of war between these three states, and of course Israel, as the leader of one of the major main alliances in the region, will also benefit it in the economic aspect, in the security aspect, in the of course in the political aspect. This is, I mean, Netanyahu is in a bad situation, is in a bad shape. What happened now that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Saudi and many other states, they accept the idea that Netanyahu tried for many years to promote, which means that peace can be reached instead of peace and not instead of territory, which is the basis for the Oslo agreement, for the Oslo process. What happened really is a big achievement for Netanyahu by this normalization agreement, and he will present it, and he is already presented for the Israelis as another big achievement of his leadership, which means that this will help him to be re-elected in Israel. So we are witnessing a victory, a success of the Israeli right vision, which is related to the internal Israeli dispute. The Israeli right vision is getting backup, is getting support from Arab states, from the Arab world. So all of this achievement, Israeli achievement, of course, will be reflected in the balance of power between Israel and the Palestinians. So we are going to lose, and we are losing again and again and again. And this normalization is a reflect of the fact that we are facing a very difficult situation of the Palestinian case, of the Palestinian question.
Thank you, Dr. Ghanem. So another question I kind of wanted to direct at all three of you. Dr. Ghanem, you mentioned legitimacy. So although these normalization agreements can definitely be viewed as, saying the quiet part out loud, part of a ongoing process that has been ongoing under the wraps, sort of. One of the core aims of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is to actually discourage countries like these from maintaining economic ties with Israel. So what long-term implications does normalization with Israel, even if it's limited to the Gulf, have for BDS efforts? And can BDS even be effective without regional or Gulf pressure on Israel? And perhaps Dr. Khalidi, you could start us off with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm going to reflect a very Euro-American perspective, which I think, as far as BDS is concerned, means that we are talking hopefully about actual boycotts of products. We are talking hopefully about divestment by institutions from companies that benefit from the occupation. And we are hopefully talking at some stage about governmental sanctions. But I think that the enormous contribution of BDS in the United States and Europe, at least, has been to open a debate that was closed, deliberately closed by the other side. Zionists, supporters of Israel do not want certain subjects discussed. And the efforts of BDS emanating from Palestinian civil society and through the work of student groups in this country and in Europe and of other groups, unions and churches and synagogues and so on, SJP, JVP, and many, many others. That effort has pried open a debate on a variety of subjects: occupation, Zionism, racism, discrimination, forms of Israeli repression, American support for Israel, things that nobody who supports Israel wants discussed at all. And frankly, I don't think that this normalization, which I agree with everything Asad said, in terms of the Arab world and in terms of the position of the Palestinians, this is a very grave blow, and it is a great victory for Netanyahu. Even though, as I said, it doesn't represent the view of overwhelming majorities of Arabs. The people are not in favor of normalization. However, here in this country and in Europe, frankly, I don't think that BDS is going to be affected. I think that even though mainstream opinion in the Democratic Party and leadership and in the Republican Party and in many European governments is in favor of normalization with Israel by those countries and by Arab countries. We're in a stage where we still have to get the Palestinian narrative out. We are in a stage where what Israel does routinely, what anybody who actually knows what's happening in Palestine is aware of, and that overwhelming majorities of people in this country and Europe are completely ignorant of, has to be put into the public domain. And BDS does that. BDS campaigns on this campus at Columbia and at Barnard and at Brown University and University of Illinois have actually educated literally thousands and thousands and thousands of American students who are going to be part of the American middle and upper middle class and elite in the decades to come. People who would never have learned about what happens in Palestine in the way that they have learned it through the debate that occurred. We've been at it the students have been at it for a year and a half, 2 years here, more really. The Barnard campaign was in 2018, so 3 years, 3.5 years. You cannot overestimate the impact of this, which is why the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which is a branch of Israeli intelligence, has been dedicated to fighting with money and spies and all kinds of efforts, hot and cold running lawyers, fighting BDS. They understand what's going on. The rug is being pulled out from under Israel in terms of the deception of vast numbers of people insofar as what happens in Palestine. And that has been largely a result of BDS. So I take everything that Asad says as absolutely correct. And I see all kinds of dangers in this. But I don't think that it affects what I see as the primary impact of BDS in this country and in Europe, which is not actual boycotts or actual divestment or actual sanctions. It's simply forcing a debate which changes the way people think about this.
So speaking of that debate and the prospect of these initiatives, Sumaya, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you're doing in Bahrain and what type of initiatives are working, not working there, and give us some background on that.
Sure, thank you. I just want to give a brief introduction about the Gulf Coalition itself. So the coalition consists of like 4 main pro-Palestine, anti-normalization civil society groups. It's the Bahraini Association Against Normalization. It's the Qatar Youth Against Normalization. It's Youth for Quds, the Gulf chapter, and BDS Kuwait. So it's the BDS chapter in Kuwait. So this is like the makeup of the Gulf Coalition, but we are not the only sort of civil society actors that are working actively to bring the Palestinian narrative, as Dr. Khalidi mentioned. There's all kinds of civil society mobilization that's been going on since the Balfour Declaration in 1917. You're talking about unions, you're talking about women's groups, you're talking about youth groups, cultural groups. So I think what's incredibly important for anyone who wants to understand the position of the Arab public, and especially like citizens of the Gulf, is that historically, this has been an issue of consensus. Like the Gulf is a region of like 50 million people, and we disagree on a lot of things, but the one thing we do agree on is Palestine. So historically, there has always been sort of collective action across different groups. And for us in the coalition, we are just sort of like one drop of a running river of groups that are trying to sort of build on this historical solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian cause, and in sort of like putting a stop to these current episodes of normalization. I know that you mentioned the instrument or the tool of boycotting, and I think that it's an incredibly powerful tool, as Dr. Khalidi mentioned, like not just for advocacy, but also to raise awareness and also to actually, pull investments. I want to mention a quick example of BDS Kuwait. So in 2014, BDS Kuwait was active in the global call to boycott the French company Viola. Viola was building a railway, had a railway project in a settlement in a Palestinian, sort of like occupied Palestinian territories. And basically there was a call to boycott Viola, to put pressure on this company, and BDS Kuwait managed to sort of get support from the Kuwaiti municipality to pull Viola from public tenders. So Viola had a lot of sort of contracts and money that they were going to gain from these contracts with the Kuwaiti municipality, and this public pressure actually worked to let the municipality pull these contracts. So I think that we don't underestimate also the economic power that boycotts can have. And boycotts are a powerful tool that have been used before BDS, right? I mean, I want to bring to attention a resolution that was passed by the Arab League. There was a resolution that was passed in the 1950s, I think 1951. And based on that resolution, all countries, including the Gulf countries, passed national legislation to have boycott offices in their country. So Bahrain had a boycott office to boycott any sort of merchandise coming in from Israel or companies, and it was there up until 2005, unfortunately, when Bahrain was discussing a free trade agreement with the US, and there was pressure during the deliberations of this free trade agreement that the US won't sign this free trade agreement until Bahrain closes this boycott office. So at least this is what we've been told. So I would not underestimate the power of boycotting. Even, I mean, as was mentioned, like even if, the official government stance now is to hold economic relations with Israel, then this is not the position of Arab publics. And us as members of civil society, we will push for boycotting as individuals, as companies. So I think that it's an incredibly powerful tool that, that we will also be sort of looking into and continue to work on. Sorry, I didn't actually answer your question about what we're doing now. So maybe I'll just quickly mention a few things that, that have happened. So as mentioned, like there is an incredible amount of consensus on this issue. Like no one agrees with this normalization. And this is exemplified in a number of different initiatives. There's so many initiatives. Like in Bahrain, there's an initiative called the National Initiative Against Normalization, and it's signed by over 20 of the biggest civil society organizations, including the biggest union, so and other sort of organizations and political groups, political associations in Bahrain who disagree on a lot of things, but they all agree on Palestine. So these are some of the things that have happened. And also for us as a coalition, we are working to build bridges, to build on this collective work with other organizations in the region, with Palestinian organizations within Palestine or outside. There was an incredible amount of support that came through a campaign called the Palestine Charter. So this was organized by a number of Gulf-based and Arab-based organizations, and they had this online like petition / charter, and we gathered 3 million signatures within 2 to 3 days. And the coalition was just one member of many, many other organizations that were working on this. So, I mean, this online petition is another tool of advocacy, another tool of affirming the people's position. And we're also, as a coalition, we have held a series of panels on different issues. For example, one of the amazing panels we had was on sort of like the history of solidarity with the Palestinian cause from the Gulf. And we had speakers from different Gulf countries talking about the solidarity that has existed since like the Balfour Declaration. There's so many like historical sort of narratives and archives that illustrate this. And this is really important for us right now because with this normalization, the public discourse is shifting. The space for us, so it's a space for us to bring these historical narratives is really, really important. You know, other things like collaboration with like Palestinian intellectuals, artists, professors, members of academia. These are all things that we are working on and we hope to build on in the future. In addition to, of course, collaboration with international global movements, like whether it's BDS, whether it's SJP. So, and this panel is just one example of this type of collective action that is incredibly important. So thank you.
Thanks, Sumaya. I have another question for Dr. Ghanem. I was just wondering if you could possibly speak to you know, the debate between the two-state versus one-state solutions. And I was wondering if you think Arab normalization or the Gulf normalization will lead to a further weakening of the two-state solution argument, and due to the fact that regional pressure is going to be less of a factor.
I just want to comment on the question of the BDS and the boycott of Israel. I think, I mean, let's be clear. I mean, Israel will make use, for sure, of any normalization with the Arab world in order to delegitimize Palestinian struggle. It's clear. I mean, we already hear this in the Gulf, in the Emirates. We already hear this in the news in Israel. And of course, I'm sure it will be used by the Israeli lobby, by the Israeli supporters, in order to say, look, we are not the problem. The problem is the other side, the Palestinians. There is no Israelis are not rejectionist to the question, the peace with the Palestinians. Palestinians are the ones who reject any kind of plan or any kind of peace or agreement or reconciliation with the Israelis. But it is already said in the public debate, in the news, and it will be used. As I said before, the second point, as I said before, it is part of the whole package of the, as I understand it, it is part of the whole package of the Trump plan. Today, it was declared that Europe is pushing the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, to get the money, the tax money from Israel, as Israel decide what should be given to the Palestinians. I don't know if you are aware of the discussion between Israel and the Palestinians about the money, tax money that should be given back to the Palestinians. And Palestinians refuse because Israel wants to take part of it because of many of things that they think that it belongs to them. So now, today, Europe declared that Palestinians should accept the money as Israel decides what is the amount should be given to Palestinians. This is very important. And second thing, it is, I'm not familiar with the economic aspects in general, but I tried to understand what is the range of the exchange of economic exchange between Israel and the Emirates. It seems to be that it is going to reach $10 billion in 5 years. It is a huge amount. It is big money, especially when Israel is facing this huge crisis, as other nations, the huge crisis of the COVID-19. But it seems that the crisis is starting to be much difficult than we were thinking. We thought in the beginning in Israel. I mean, it seems that Israel it will take more than 1 decade to Israel to recover the effects, the economic effects. The normalization with the Gulf states, with mainly with the United Arab Emirates, will help Israel recover the economic damage of the COVID-19. So this should be clear. I mean, will be used. It is already used. The normalization with the Arab world. And I don't know if you heard about this, that Emirates decide to change the textbooks for the students. I mean, this is also part of the normalization, to say that all the Jewish history in the Arab Peninsula, it is a new trend that you will witness more and more Arabs that speaks about the rights of the Jews in the Arab Peninsula. So let's be ready to a new front, a new Israeli efforts to delegitimize the Palestinian historical narrative and to put up on the table the Israeli, not the Israeli right, Benjamin Netanyahu narrative, which is also related to your question. As I believe, the question of the two states is already over for 2 decades. It's nothing new. But now it's clear that Netanyahu is against the two-state solution. I mean, the classical two-state solution. He's for 2 states. He's for 1 state plus a mini state in the West Bank. And this gets support from part of Arab states. And the idea of Netanyahu, which is against the two-state solution, will get more and more support in the Arab. I'm not saying that we are close to the 1-state democratic state. I'm saying we are far from the 2-state. The two-state solution is too late for the two-state solution. Maybe it is too early for the 1-state democratic state, but it is our duty. I mean, at least I think that it is my duty to continue and push the idea there is alternative to the two-state solution, which is the one democratic state in Palestine, for Palestinians, for Israelis, for anyone that wants to live with us in this land. Thank you.
So how do you also, Dr. Ghanem, how do you think the normalization is impacting the approach by the PA, the Palestinian Authority? Do they have to change their approach? What are they gonna?
Of course. I mean, one of my main concerns, it is not only the normalization. As I said, it is a reflection of the Palestinian situation for many years. I mean, everybody that is familiar with the Palestinian case knows the books of Professor Khalidi and many others, intellectuals, Palestinian activists, who came up with ideas how to improve the quality of the political decision-making among the Palestinians. And I'm afraid that now there is a wave of condemnation of the normalization. There is a wave of a lot of talk among Palestinians in all levels, in the leadership, in the community, in the intellectual level. We have a lot of things to say about normalization. But I'm afraid that Palestinian leadership will do nothing to improve the quality of decision-making among the Palestinians. This is another wave. They will pass the wave and we will continue with the same conduct, which is very bad. I mean, this is also the normalization of the Arab world. It's a failure of the Palestinian diplomacy. It's very clear that this is a failure of Palestinian diplomacy in the Arab world, at least in the Arab world. So I'm really concerned that Palestinian Authority, at least the leadership, they are not really capable of dealing with this situation. And something has to be changed from the roots to rebuild our, as I believe, to rebuild our representative bodies. I'm thinking that it is very important to keep the PLO, but it is a mistake to give our decision making only to the PA level. We, the Palestinian people, let's take the initiative again and try to push forward to build up our Palestinian, all Palestinians, including the Palestinians in Israel, Palestinians in 48, leadership. And it is the right time to go forward, to push forward, to say to Abu Mazen and his group, That's okay. You failed to reach what you promised for the Palestinians. I think that it is time to make a deep and real change in the leadership level, not only in the personal level, but also in the strategic choices of this leadership.
So on that note, going forward, and perhaps kind of like a concluding thought, Dr. Khalidi, how can the Palestinians further adjust or tailor their struggle in light of these developments? And could you speak to what the focus should be in the coming stages?
Well, it's an important question, but it's a really hard question to answer. I think that the Palestinian struggle has to be more focused on issues of justice and equality. I think that we're stuck in a rhetoric of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and we have to adapt ourselves to the 2010s and 2020s, both in terms of advocacy abroad for Palestine and in terms of the Palestinian leadership. It's painful to read what the PA or Hamas produce, because they're not talking about the 21st century. Their thinking is rooted in the past of the Palestinian struggle. I agree with everything that Assad said. We have a decrepit, bankrupt leadership which has no ideas, which has done nothing to advance the Palestinian cause, in my view. And that extends to all aspects of the Palestinian leadership. It has no legitimacy. If there were an election that said, Fatah, Hamas, none of the above, I think a majority would probably vote for none of the above. And I would say that's true inside Palestine and outside Palestine. But you need a political alternative. It's not enough to say we need these ideas or we need a strategy. And I'm a historian. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a real activist. Once upon a time, I did stuff that was trying to change the world. I'm now trying to analyze the world, and I can't tell you what is the best way to go forward in terms of creating a political vehicle that can do what Assad is saying, revive the PLO such that we don't have a leadership rooted only in the Palestinians inside Palestine. They're half of the Palestinians, and they don't include the Palestinians inside Israel, the 2 million highly evolved Palestinians who have dealt more directly with Zionism and Israel's policies than any other group of Palestinians. Those are not represented in the PA, nor are all of the 6 or so, however many million Palestinians who live outside. The PLO supposedly represents all of those groups, and that has to be revived. How that is to happen, I really don't know. I do know that this leadership should go. If they had any self-respect, they would have gone long ago. They were elected 14 years ago, and that's or more. And that means they have no legitimacy. They should leave. However, politics is not just a matter of what you want. Politics is a matter of what political grouping or vehicle is able to move. And I don't have an answer to that. I think that what we see in Palestinian politics today is a bubbling up in Palestinian civil society of alternatives and ideas that are much more attuned to the time that we're actually in, the 21st century, in the 2020s, and which takes into account the experiences and the failures and the defeats and the successes of Palestinian nationalism and the Palestinian national movement over the last 100 years. That's yet to be reflected, unfortunately, in most of the political leadership that sadly the Palestinians have. How we go from where ordinary people probably have a better idea of what is to be done, and civil society represents the most evolved strands of thinking in Palestinian society, to a situation where that changes the leadership, I don't know. Because that's politics. That involves things like patronage. They have money. That involves things like control of the means of repression. They have guns. That involves things like external factors. The United States and Israel support the Palestinian Authority. They created it in a certain sense, in their image, to do what they wanted. How do you deal with those realities? How do you deal with those factors? Foreign powers are up to their ears intervening in Palestinian politics. Not just Israel and the United States, Turkey, Iran, and others are deeply involved. Assad rightly pointed to the EU. The EU is trying to pressure the PA to do the things that the EU wants. So you have to have real world answers to those kinds of questions. How do you deal with external pressure? How do you deal with these realities that these guys, these old men, have the guns? These old men have the money. They have the patronage. They're paying half salaries, but they're still paying half salaries. Hundreds of thousands of people are dependent on the authority in Ramallah for their livelihood, families, tens of thousands, and the leadership in Gaza. So those are real world political questions I don't have an answer to.
Thanks, Dr. Khalidi. I mean, there's so many more questions I would want to ask about the path forward, but I fear we're out of time, and I definitely want to get to some of the questions from viewers, because they do seem very interesting. From Ahlam, and maybe this is a good question for Sumaya, why don't we see demonstrations in the streets of the Arab countries against normalization like we saw during Camp David or during the Jordanian agreement?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think I would answer with if they could, they would, you know? If people are able to express their opinion, they will, and they have. And I think it's not really fair to judge public opinion or public support just by demonstrations. It's not the only vehicle to express support. I mean, and also just timing, like just because of COVID, like it's actually difficult to organize public events. But I mean, as you know, like the space to actually do that is varying in different Arab countries to mobilize and organize like rallies or demonstrations. It really is, it depends on the context of each country. But I think that in the ways that people can express solidarity, they have. And I think sometimes that, you know, if a lot of the English media, Western media doesn't really do a good job of reflecting this. That's why things like the Arab Opinion Index that Dr. Khalidi mentioned early on in the panel is really important. It's a systematic way to actually measure people's opinion on this issue over a number of years. So, so yeah, I think hopefully that answers the question.
And just to jump around a little bit, Eva had kind of a related question, how the governments of countries that have already established relations with Israel in the past, like Jordan and Egypt, how have they reacted officially to the current wave of normalization? What statements have they made? What are their stances?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, I think definitely Egypt issued a statement saying that they welcome this, the signing of accords, which was expected. Like, I don't think that we didn't expect this. I mean, I see Mala also mentioned, posted something about demonstrations in Bahrain. Yeah, there have been like on a very sort of small scale. I think the main challenge, to be honest, like right now for expressing public solidarity is that a lot of these things used to be legal. Like you could actually apply for a permit to go to a rally or organize a protest, but these things are becoming more so illegal, and even something like, you know, the Bahraini Association Against Normalization, which is a registered civil society organization, right? They have their own headquarters, they can organize events, and they have been, but now there's a question around, well, will these pro-Palestine societies actually have the space to continue to operate? This is a question that we are thinking about, yeah.
Thanks. Dr. Ghanem, I think the next question from Saiful is, I want to direct at you. I think we should just focus on the second part, but where is the hope for the Palestinian struggle for justice? Maybe you can give us some insight from Palestinian citizens in Israel. What is driving them? What is giving them momentum? What do they need to think about for the future?
Basically, I think that, you know, the nations, it doesn't have the luxury to sit down and to say nothing could be done. I mean, look, following the Nakba, just in 5, maybe 6 years after the Nakba, Palestinian youngs in Kuwait, Yasser Arafat and his colleagues, they start the rebuilding of Palestinian national movement. Fatah first and later other factions, other political parties. So, I mean, although it is a very, how to say, it's a very bad moment in our history, should be clear that we must do something. And first, to start with what Professor Khalidi mentioned, to start with rebuilding of our agent. We need the agent, we need the PLO, we need something to represent us, internally and externally, to express our views, our needs, and this should be done by democratic means. It can be done, and it is the time to be done. And secondly, it is clear that, and it is not new. It is in the last few years, many intellectuals, Palestinians and others, including Israeli Jews, few Israeli Jews, they claim the need to go back to the origin of the conflict, which is a reflection of the settler colonial aggression against the Palestinians. And it is not a simple struggle between two nations, as was presented in the last, at least since Oslo. So it is time to go back to the basic idea that this is a kind of settler colonialism, and this should be stopped. In my view, according to the one state, one democratic state. And this requires to rebuild our understanding what is Palestine. Palestine is not the state of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Palestine, we know what's Palestine. Palestine is what we call the historical Palestine. This is Palestine. And this means to also to rebuild the meaning of who are the Palestinians, and who should be represented in the PLO, in the democratic PLO. All Palestinians, including Palestinians in Israel, they were excluded since, as you know, in 1948 from the Palestinian national movement. And the PLO intentionally, they took measures, steps against the representation of the Palestinians as part of the Palestinian national movement. It is time to go back to the fact that we are one nation, one national group. So, and this is related to Palestinians in Israel. Look, Palestinians in Israel, in the symbolic level, in the political declarative level, they are part of the Palestinian people. They are very close to the Fatih people, Fatih, the mainstream among Palestinians. In the daily life, we are part of the Israeli life. In the economic, social, cultural, I'm teaching at an Israeli university. So we are engaged with the Israelis. So it is, in many ways, we tried to build our own institution as a national minority. We failed. And we failed because we are part of a larger question. We are part of a larger, of the larger Palestinian nation. And it is time, again, among Palestinians and Israel, to promote the idea that we should be, we have our own problems, we have our own concerns as Israeli citizens, but of course, we should be part of the general Palestinian struggle. I mean, taking into consideration, as I believe, that the two-state solution is over, and we should seek a new idea, a new solution. In this stage, I don't think that we are going to build the one-state solution, but it is very important to promote the idea that we, the Palestinians, have one vision, one joint vision to rebuild our credibility, rebuild our vision, rebuild our story as one, our narrative as one nation, was one national group. And one last comment. I mean, Palestinians in Israel, they achieved a lot. I mean, look, I made a research, and in the 50s, in the 59, 60, there was only 10 Arab students, Arab Palestinians from Israel students. Now we have 60,000 every year, every moment. We have 60,000. 40% of Israeli medicine doctors in the hospitals are Arabs. So we have this middle class. We are very strong in the individual level. In the collective, we suffer from a lot of problems. So we need to rebuild our collective identity. And I claim, my argument is that we should also take into consideration that we are part of the larger Palestinian people, and we are not only Israeli citizens. We are part of the Palestinian problem. Thanks.
Thanks, Professor. So I think maybe we can take 2 more questions and then call it. But Etizaz wants to know, what do people in Palestine think of the role of Iran and Turkey in the current situation? Also, is there the current wave of normalization is more of a fear of Iran, or is it basically more for economic benefits? Sumaya, do you think you want to take that one?
I mean, I think the first one, the first part maybe Dr. Asad can take it, about the Palestinian position. The second part is the current wave of normalization more of a fear of Iran, or basically for economic benefit? I mean, I think that it's a tricky question, because and again, like I'm speaking, like I represent my own opinion at this point, like I'm not representing like the coalition, just as a quick disclaimer. But I think that whatever, like, it's incredibly frustrating, because I think that these decisions that are being made are really short-sighted. Like, I think in the Gulf, we do need a comprehensive security sort of approach to different issues. But the way that the approach that has been adopted so far is just incredibly short-sighted. I mean, Iran is a troublemaker in the region. There is no shadow of a doubt on that. But the way that you deal with this sort of problem is not by aligning with Israel and creating security alliances with them. I think that, you know, as a Gulf region, the first priority should be building local capacity, national capacity, and like having that regional cooperation, which is not happening, as you can see in the current geopolitical map. So I think that, and another thing is that, you know, Iran is just going to benefit from this, right? I mean, Iran can now depict itself as the only supporter of the Palestinian cause. I mean, it can point to the Gulf states and say, well, you've signed accords with Israel. We are the only sort of supporter of the Palestinian cause. And so it actually could benefit this Iranian narrative and cause more sort of regional tensions. So I think that the question on economic benefits, I don't know. I don't think so. Like, I think it's more of an alliance, as Dr. Asad in the beginning mentioned. Like, it's just sort of like this regional geopolitical situation that we have, but it's incredibly short-sighted, because it's not going to benefit us in the region or the Palestinians or anyone else. So, yeah.
Thanks, Sumaya. Dr. Ghanem, do you have anything to add to that? And then I think I'm gonna direct the last.
Basically, I mean, you know, all this fights, all this war. I mean, the situation between Israel, Iran, and Turkey, we are the biggest loser. I mean, we are the Palestinians are the one that lose much more than any other side. So basically, the idea, I mean, my idea, I think that many Palestinians share with me this idea that we need to take the initiative. We need to go back to the idea of taking our destiny in our hands. I mean, the question of the independence of decision by the Palestinians, and we should start from our. I mean, look. I mean, all the experience of the PLO, when the PLO took the initiative in the early 70s to move toward the two-state solution, the Europe, United States, parts of Israel, and the Arab world supported the PLO. So it is time to go back and to take the initiative and to say to the world, as Professor Khalidi said, what is our vision? What do we want? Peace and justice. What is the meaning of peace and justice? And it is time to be clear in what we really want. And this requires a change in our leadership. The current leadership cannot make it. It is almost proven. It is clear. Thanks.
Thanks. So Jake's question, I want to direct at Dr. Khalidi. This is something that I'm pretty optimistic about, and I was wondering if you could speak to, you know, the gradually, very slowly, but gradually shifting thoughts on Palestinians and Palestine in the U.S. and some of the developments we've seen in the Democratic Party recently.
A couple things. I just want to add to what Asad said, which I fully agree with, and touch on something that Sumaya said, which is one of the pathetic manifestations of the recent past is the utter weakness of the Arab states. Several of them have been destroyed by external intervention. American invasion of Iraq destroyed an Arab country, sanctions and then invasion. Some of them have been destroyed by civil war, intervention and civil war, Syria, Yemen, Libya. Others have been sabotaged from within by dictatorship and corruption, Egypt. You once had a region that had multiple states, that had, whatever you thought of their policies, that had an enormous standing in the world. And today, you have a region in which three regional superpowers, Israel, Turkey, and Iran, dominate a flat space where the Arabs basically are, as I'd said, a sort of playground for great powers, external to the region or regional great powers. And to deal with a country like Iran, Sumaya talks about Iran making trouble. Iran does, partly because there's a vacuum in this region. And partly because you have governments that do not represent their people. In recent decades, many regions of the world, most regions of the world, have moved from dictatorship to democracy. Latin America was checkered with horrible military dictatorships. Most of those countries are now democratic. So was Southeast Asia, so was South Asia, so was East Asia, so was Africa, so was East Europe, communist regimes. All of them are gone. Now, democracy doesn't give you perfect governance. Look at the United States. Look at Russia, look at any number of democratic countries, look at Turkey. Terrible governments in many cases, corruption in many cases. But it's better than military dictatorship. There's a possibility of the popular will expressing itself in a regime, in a government which is based on consent of the governed. The Arab world doesn't have that. There are a few countries in the Arab world where there are some parliamentary institutions, Morocco, Lebanon, Kuwait. But in most countries in the Arab world, those things don't even exist, or where they are, they're simply puppets for the generals or for the kings and sultans. That has to change for the Arab world to cease to be a playground of other powers. That's the first thing I wanted to say, just to conclude that. And as far as encouraging signs in this country, I mean, I think there's been a revolutionary change in American discourse in the public sphere where Palestine is concerned. You don't see that in the mainstream corporate media, and you don't see that at the top of the political system. The leadership of the Democratic Party, which is unrepresentative of the base, and the leadership of the Republican Party, which is fully representative of its base, is entirely pro-Israel. But if you look at the majority party in the United States, which is the Democratic Party, they won 10 million more votes than the Republicans in the midterm elections of 2018, and they've won and they won popular vote majorities in almost every one of the last 7 of the last 8 presidential elections. That's the majority party. If you look at public opinion in the Democratic Party, it's much more critical of Israel and much more supportive of Palestinian rights than it ever was in the past. In fact, it's almost evenly balanced. And this is an indication of a change that we've never seen before in any American political party. And you see that reflected not just in the people who have already been elected in 2018 or before, and who have already expressed themselves either as critical of Israel or as supportive of Palestinian rights, whether in the House or in a few cases in the Senate. Senator Sanders, obviously Senator Van Hollen of Michigan. But in the way in which Democratic primaries are going, in Illinois, in Georgia, in New York State, again and again, Democratic primaries in districts that are overwhelmingly Democratic have returned candidates who were opposed by AIPAC, who were openly willing to say things supportive of Palestinian rights, and who have argued for conditions on aid to Israel. This never happened in American politics. You can go back to Woodrow Wilson, and you will not find this level of openness to the Palestinian narrative ever at any level of American politics. We're still nowhere near a change in policy. Policy is made by policy elites in this country who have paid no attention to public opinion. They do, from administration to administration. The Democrats bring in the same people, and the Republicans, Biden will bring in the same hacks who worked for Obama, the same clapped out pro-Israel types who worked for Clinton. There will be no change in personnel from the faces that we've grown to love and to know and detest in both of those administrations. But we will have in Congress, at the base of the Democratic Party, among younger people, on campuses, younger people in the Jewish community, many more churches, many more unions, something that never existed in the United States. Never in the history of the United States and its relation to Palestine has there been a willingness to listen to the Palestinian narrative the way that we have today. Academia has changed completely. You couldn't find a book on Palestine when I was an undergraduate, which is a very long time ago. And you couldn't find a book decades after that. And if you found a book, then Ibrahim Abu Lughad had a book. There were 3, 4, 5, Edward Said had a book. And that was it. Today, sociology, anthropology, political science, history, literature, there are hundreds of books being published, which give a perfectly objective, sometimes good, sometimes bad books, but which give a perfectly objective version of history or literature or whatever, and which open up for students, undergraduates and graduate students, whole worlds. The Journal of Palestine Studies, I'm the co-editor of. We have 200,000 downloads a year, more than 200,000 downloads a year of articles from the Journal of Palestine Studies. Those are mainly students. And that means that that this narrative, which the major effort of Zionism, Edward Said said this long ago, they won on the field of discourse before they won on any battlefield. Before they expelled one Palestinian, they had won the discursive battle in this country, okay? Is one of Said's many brilliant insights. Well, they're not winning it anymore. They're losing it. In academia, they have lost it. The whole narrative, desert, bloom, their leaders made their people lead. Every single lying element of that narrative has been completely discredited in academia. You cannot get up at a conference and say those things. The books that maintain those lies, those half-truths, nobody pays any attention to them anymore. So there has been remarkable change. There's a huge way to go to change actual politics and policy. But that's to my way of thinking, a very, very encouraging sign. And I have to say, I think that there's all kinds of reasons for this change, but one of the major reasons is that Palestinian civil society, through BDS and through other efforts, has done what the bankrupt, failed Palestinian leadership has shown itself completely unable to do, which is to reach out in a way that touches on concerns that people in the rest of the world have, speaking to universal issues like justice and equality and so forth. And they've been remarkably effective. And you know, Assad correctly said that one of the reasons the Palestine cause was successful in the 60s and 70s is because the PLO actually had a strategy, actually had a diplomatic, serious diplomatic approach, and did serious public relations. Actually tried to convince people all over the world. They were very effective in the third world, in Europe and many other parts of the world. Not very effective in the United States. Leadership has meant that there is no Palestinian diplomacy today. There is no Palestinian public relations. But civil society has stepped into that gap, at least as far as reaching very important segments of public opinion in Europe and the United States are concerned.
Thank you, Professor Khalidi. I think we're well over time, so I think we do want to end it here. But I mean, if there are any more questions, please feel free to email them to us, and we can pass them along or try to answer them ourselves. To our panel, thank you so much for those overseas. I mean, we appreciate you coming on with us, even though the time difference is a bit of an issue. Dr. Khalidi, thank you again for speaking today. I mean, SJP, shout out to them for all the work they've been doing for divestment at Columbia. I mean, you led that whole charge and it succeeded. So thank you. And then to all our attendees, we had great turnout today for our first Zoom event of the season. So I think that's great. And thank you to all of you. Sarah, do you have anything to say to close out?
We'll be, we have a recording for people who were not able to make it, and we'll discuss with the panelists whether we can disseminate it or not, permission-wise. But yeah, thank you everyone, and we'll be on a lookout. We'll be sending information for our next event, which will be led by another member of our group around elections and what justice work around Palestine can look like before and after the elections, regardless of who wins. But anyways, on that hopeful note, thank you all and have a great day. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.